The sun doesn't just shine in the Mojave Desert in July, it weaponizes the air itself. Robert Chen felt his tongue swell against his teeth as he stared at the shimmering heat waves rising from the cracked asphalt 20 yards ahead. The kind of heat that turns your spit to paste. The kind that makes your eyeballs ache. His truck, a reliable F-150 that had never let him down, sat silent behind him. Engine seized, radiator hissing its last breath into the 118-degree afternoon. The temperature gauge had redlined 15 minutes before the entire drivetrain gave up. He was 40 miles from Pahrump, maybe more. No cell service. No passing traffic for the last 6 hours. Just him, a folding knife, half a bottle of warm water, and the hard-earned skills from 12 years in special forces that he'd hoped he'd never need again. The Mojave doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about your service record or your survival training. It simply takes. Robert Chun had 72 hours to prove that training still mattered. Preparation is a mindset. Survival is a tactic. This is Expert Survival Guide. Robert Ironside Chun earned his nickname during a firefight in Helmand Province when shrapnel tore through his plate carrier, and he kept operating for another 2 hours before accepting medical evacuation. 12 years with 5th Special Forces Group. For deployments, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape qualified. The kind of operator who could navigate by stars, purify water with nothing but sunlight and plastic, and maintain operational effectiveness on minimal resources. But that was 6 years ago. Now, at 50 years old, he ran a small security consulting firm in Las Vegas, teaching corporate executives about risk management and contingency planning. The irony wasn't lost on him as he stood in the middle of Nevada State Route 372, a forgotten strip of deteriorating highway that connected nowhere to nothing. He'd been driving cross-country, visiting his daughter in San Diego before heading to a training contract in Utah. The shortcut through the Mojave had seemed logical on the map. Shave off 3 hours. Avoid the I-15 traffic. The desert had other plans. Standing at the rear of his disabled truck, Robert conducted a hasty inventory. 1 Benchmade folding knife, 3.5-inch blade, half bottle of water, maybe 10 ounces, a lighter with questionable fuel, spare tire and jack, useless without a working vehicle, road flares, 3 of them, first aid kit, basic, in the cab, the clothes on his back, jeans, cotton t-shirt, hiking boots, a ball cap, sunglasses, no emergency blanket, no water filtration, no signaling mirror, the kind of oversight that gets people killed in environments like this. The professional part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive in Kandahar and Jalalabad, immediately began calculating water deficit rate at this temperature, electrolyte depletion, heat casualty timeline, extraction probability. The numbers weren't good. Before we continue with Robert's story, I want to know, drop your city or state in the comments below. Where are you watching from? Because knowing your environment is the first rule of survival preparation. And I want to know where the Expert Survival Guide community is operating from around the world. Robert checked his watch. 14:47 hours. The sun wouldn't set for another 5 hours, and the temperature would remain lethal until well after dark. He'd already made his first critical error, taking the shortcut. Now he faced the second decision that would determine whether he lived or died. Stay with the vehicle or move. Every survival manual, every SEER instructor, every search and rescue protocol screamed the same answer: stay with the vehicle. It's a much larger visual signature than a human body. It provides shade and shelter. It's where rescuers will expect to find you. But Robert knew something those manuals didn't account for. No one knew he was here. His daughter expected him in 3 days. His business partner thought he was still in San Diego. He'd deliberately chosen this route to avoid the interstate traffic, which meant he'd also avoided the one place where people actually traveled. He'd seen 2 vehicles in 6 hours, both heading the opposite direction before the breakdown. The tactical situation was clear: 0 probability of timely rescue at current position. Robert walked a slow perimeter around the truck, his boots crunching on heat-fractured asphalt. To the north, nothing but creosote flats and distant mountains, hazy in the thermal distortion. To the south, the same, east and west, The road disappeared into shimmering mirages in both directions. He knew from the map he'd studied earlier that Pahrump was roughly 40 miles southwest. There was a smaller settlement, barely a truck stop, maybe 25 miles southeast. But without GPS, without landmarks, the Mojave was a navigation nightmare. The sun was an oven element pressed against his neck. His shirt was already soaked through. Robert made his decision. He would stay until sunset, use the remaining daylight to prepare, then move during the night when temperatures would drop to a survivable 90 degrees. He'd follow the road southeast, conserving energy, moving slowly, and covering maybe 10 to 12 miles before the sun rose again. It wasn't a great plan, but in special forces, they taught him that a good plan executed violently now was better than a perfect plan executed too late. Robert spent the next 3 hours preparing for movement with the methodical efficiency that had been drilled into him at Fort Bragg. First, heat mitigation. He removed the spare tire from the truck bed and used his knife to carefully cut sections from the rubber mat beneath it. These strips would wrap around his forearms and neck. Improvised sun protection. The rubber would be hot, but it was opaque, and that mattered. He tore strips from the truck's upholstery, wetting them with precious drops from his water bottle, and created a damp bandana for his neck. The evaporative cooling would buy him maybe 30 minutes of reduced core temperature. Second, signaling equipment. Robert positioned the truck's side mirrors in a configuration that would catch the morning sun from the east. He used the road flares to create large arrows on the pavement pointing southeast, indicating his direction of travel to any potential rescuers. The flares wouldn't burn long, but they'd leave a visible mark. He wrote a message on the truck's dusty hood with his finger, heading SE on foot to RT-160. Robert Chun, July 19th. Third, water strategy. 10 ounces of water in 118-degree heat. In optimal conditions, the human body needs approximately 1 gallon per day in desert environments. Under exertion, that number doubles. Robert had maybe 3 hours of operational capacity with what he had. He opened the truck's radiator, carefully, releasing pressure gradually. The coolant was toxic, undrinkable, but he soaked another strip of cloth in it and tied it around his head under his cap. The chemical smell was nauseating, but the cooling effect was immediate. He checked the windshield washer fluid reservoir. Blue antifreeze solution, equally toxic. Not an option. Then he remembered. The air conditioning condensation drip pan. Robert crawled under the truck's chassis, feeling the radiant heat from the asphalt burn through his shirt. There, a small puddle of water that had condensed from the AC system before it died. Maybe 4 ounces. He used his cupped hands to collect it, filtering it through his t-shirt into his water bottle. It tasted like rust and dust, but it was H2O, and that made it worth more than gold. Total inventory now, 14 ounces of water. Maybe 6 hours if he rationed perfectly. Fourth, equipment configuration. Robert used his knife to cut the truck's seat belt webbing, creating a crude shoulder strap for his water bottle. He fashioned a second strap from the floor mats to carry his small first aid kit. The Benchmade knife went on his belt. He removed the truck's dome light cover and pocketed it. Clear plastic that could potentially be used for solar water distillation if he found a depression or container. From the glove box, a handful of fast food napkins, tinder, a pen, puncture tool if needed, his registration papers, more tinder or signaling material. Fifth, navigation preparation. Robert didn't have a compass, but he had something better, a lifetime of land navigation training. He waited until the sun was low enough to observe its angle safely. In July, in Nevada, sunset would be almost directly west, perhaps slightly northwest. He identified a distinctive rock formation on the horizon to the southeast and memorized its shape. He would use that formation as his initial azimuth marker. As the sun finally touched the horizon, painting the desert in shades of copper and blood, Robert took one last look at his truck. 6 years of civilian life, and here he was again, alone, undersupplied, in hostile terrain. The difference was that this time, there was no extraction team, no QRF on standby, no medevac on call, just him and the skills he'd hoped would stay theoretical. Let me break down what Robert did right here, because this could save your life. Body temperature regulation in extreme heat. The human core temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. At 104 degrees, you're experiencing heat exhaustion. At 106 degrees, Organ damage begins. Robert understood that his primary enemy wasn't thirst, it was hyperthermia. His makeshift sun barriers, rubber strips, dampened cloth, were utilizing evaporative cooling, the same principle your body uses when sweating. In zero-humidity desert environments, evaporation happens rapidly, creating genuine temperature reduction. The radiator coolant decision. Never, and I mean never, drink automotive fluids. Ethylene glycol antifreeze causes acute kidney failure. Even small amounts can be fatal. Robert used it only for external cooling, and even that carried risk of absorption through skin. This was a calculated, desperate measure, not a recommended technique. Water calculation. The military teaches a formula. In temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, humans need approximately 1 liter, that's 34 ounces, per hour of moderate activity. Robert had 14 ounces total. This gave him roughly 20 to 30 minutes of movement capability before severe dehydration would impair judgment and motor function. His decision to move only at night was textbook SEER protocol. Reduce exertion during peak heat. Maximize movement during thermal minimum. Stay or go? This is controversial, and I want you to understand why Robert made the choice he did. The standard advice, stay with your vehicle. Assume someone knows where you are. Robert's situation was different. This is called a zero notification scenario. No one was looking for him yet. No one would be for days. In these cases, the calculation changes. If rescue probability is near zero and environmental lethality is near certain, movement becomes the statistically better option. Now, here's what you need to know. Robert was about to learn that movement in the Mojave comes with costs he hadn't calculated. At 20-15 hours, with the sky shifting from purple to black and the temperature finally dropping below 100 degrees, Robert Chin began walking southeast on Nevada State Route 372. The first hour was almost pleasant. The asphalt retained the day's heat, radiating it upward through his boots, but the air temperature had dropped to a bearable 94 degrees. Stars emerged in impossible numbers, the kind of night sky that only exists far from city light pollution. Robert fell into the rhythm of movement that had been drilled into him during ruck marches at Fort Bragg: measured pace, controlled breathing, periodic hydration checks. He allowed himself 2 small sips of water every 30 minutes. The road stretched ahead, a darker ribbon against the dark desert, visible only because of its unnatural straightness. He'd covered maybe 3 miles when the cramps started. First in his calves, sudden, violent contractions that nearly dropped him to the pavement. Then his hamstrings. The electrolyte depletion was hitting faster than he'd calculated. Robert stopped, breathing through the pain, manually stretching the knotted muscles. His shirt was soaked again despite the cooler air. In the desert, you don't stop sweating just because the sun goes down. You sweat until there's nothing left to sweat. He checked his water, half gone already. For miles into a 25-mile journey, the math was impossible. At the 3-hour mark, Robert encountered his first serious problem. The road forked. He hadn't anticipated this. The map he'd memorized showed Route 372 as a straight shot southeast. But here, in the darkness, a second paved road branched off to the south. No signs, no markers, just 2 identical strips of cracked asphalt disappearing into the night. Robert stopped, forcing himself to think clearly despite the growing fog in his head. Dehydration was already affecting cognitive function. He could feel it in the extra seconds it took to process information. He looked up at the stars. Polaris, the North Star, was behind him and slightly to his right. That confirmed he'd been moving generally southeast. The fork to his left curved more eastward. The right fork continued south-southwest. Every instinct told him southeast was correct, toward Route 160 and civilization. But instinct without confirmation gets people killed. Robert walked 50 yards down each fork, looking for any indication of greater use. Newer pavement, less accumulated sand, anything. Both roads looked equally abandoned. He made the decision based on terrain logic. Water flows downhill, and humans build settlements near water. The right fork angled slightly downward into what might be a distant valley. The left fork stayed level. He took the right fork. It was a guess. In the desert, guesses have consequences. At 1:30 hours, approximately 7 miles from his truck, Robert's boot caught on a broken section of pavement he hadn't seen in the darkness. The fall happened in slow motion, the way traumatic events always do. His hands went out instinctively, palms hitting asphalt, followed by his right knee, then his hip. The water bottle flew from his shoulder strap, bouncing twice on the road. Robert heard it before he saw it, the sound of plastic cracking, followed by the soft patter of water spreading across pavement. No. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, reaching for the bottle in the darkness. His fingers found it, split along the side seam, maybe 2 ounces remaining at the bottom, the rest already soaked into the porous desert road. 5 ounces of water gone. Just like that. Robert sat back on the pavement, breathing hard, staring at the dark, wet patch that represented the difference between uncomfortable survival and probable death. For the first time since the truck died, he felt the cold edge of real fear. Robert forced himself to stop, assess, and adapt. Current situation: approximately 7 miles from disabled vehicle, approximately 18 miles from probable civilization. If he'd chosen correctly, 2 ounces of water remaining. Minor road rash on hands and right knee. Time: 1:45 hours. Temperature: approximately 87 degrees Fahrenheit. He had maybe 3 hours before sunrise. At sunrise, the temperature would climb rapidly. By 8 o'clock, it would be over 100 degrees again. By noon, 115 degrees or higher. The math was simple. He couldn't cover 18 miles in 3 hours. Not at night, not in his current state, not without water, which meant he needed a different plan. Robert looked around with fresh, tactical eyes. The road was useless. No shelter, no shade, no water. But 50 yards to the south, barely visible in the starlight, he could see the dark shape of an erosion channel cutting through the desert floor. Washes and arroyos, the dry riverbeds that channeled flash floods during the rare desert rains. They meant several things. 1. Lower elevation, potentially cooler microclimate. 2. Possibility of residual moisture underground. 3. Natural shade from embankments. 4. Vegetation, which meant roots, which meant water had been there at some point. Robert changed his plan. He would move to the wash, find shelter before sunrise, and survive the coming day. Then, if he was still capable, he'd continue movement the following night. One day at a time. One decision at a time. The wash was deeper than it looked from the road. A 15-foot deep channel with crumbling earthen walls carved by centuries of flash floods. The bottom was sand and gravel, littered with dried creosote branches and the skeletal remains of cholla cactus. Robert searched the embankments using the faint starlight, looking for an overhang or undercut that could provide shade. His hands traced the walls, feeling for cavities. 30 yards downstream, he found it. A shallow alcove carved into the north-facing bank, maybe 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide. The ceiling was low. He'd have to sit hunched or lie down, but it faced away from the southern sun, and the earthen walls would provide insulation. It wasn't comfortable, but comfort wasn't the mission. Survival was. Robert crawled into the space, immediately disturbing something that scuttled away in the darkness. Scorpion, probably, or a desert centipede. He didn't care anymore. He was beyond the luxury of being choosy about roommates. He arranged himself in the coolest position possible, lying on his side in the sand, back pressed against the earthen wall, which still retained some of the night's cooler temperature. From his first aid kit, he removed the small packet of alcohol wipes and cleaned the road rash on his hands and knee. The sting was clarifying, a sharp reminder that he was still capable of feeling pain, which meant he was still capable of feeling. He allowed himself a single sip of water, less than an ounce, and felt it absorb into his mouth tissues before he even swallowed. The sky above the wash was lightening. Sunrise was maybe 90 minutes away. Robert closed his eyes, forcing his body into a state of tactical rest, not real sleep, but a conscious reduction of metabolic activity. In SEER school, they'd called it combat napping, the ability to recover while maintaining situational awareness. He would need every bit of strength for what was coming. This is critical information, so pay attention. Why Robert chose the wash. Desert terrain seems uniformly hostile, but it has microclimates that can mean the difference between survival and heat casualty. Washes and arroyos provide 1. Thermal protection. Earth is an excellent insulator. Underground temperatures stay relatively constant. In the Mojave, soil temperature at 3 feet depth remains around 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, even when surface temps exceed 120 degrees. 2. Shade geometry. A north-facing alcove receives zero direct sunlight during peak heating hours, 10 to 1600 hours. This alone can reduce felt temperature by 30 to 40 degrees. 3. Reduced wind exposure. Wind accelerates dehydration through increased evaporation. Sheltered positions reduce this effect. The flash flood risk. Yes, desert washes are dangerous during monsoon season. But Robert made a calculated assessment. Clear sky, no visible cloud formation. July in southern Nevada. Outside typical monsoon period, August through September. The risk was acceptably low. Never shelter in a wash if you see clouds, especially towering cumulus. You're in monsoon season. You hear distant thunder. The wash shows signs of recent water flow. Wet sand, debris and branches. Water rationing reality. Robert had approximately 1.5 ounces of water left. The human body can survive roughly 3 days without water in moderate conditions. In the Mojave in July, that drops to 24 to 36 hours before organ failure begins. But here's what matters. Cognitive impairment begins at just 2% dehydration. Decision-making, judgment, motor control, all degraded. By 5% dehydration, which Robert was approaching, you're operating at maybe 60% mental capacity. This is why survival is about early decisions. The longer you wait, the less capable you become of making the right choices. Robert was about to discover that the desert saves its worst for midday. Robert woke to an oven. The sun had been up for 3 hours, and even in the sheltered alcove, the temperature had climbed to the point where breathing felt like inhaling hot sand. His watch read 9:47. The temperature outside the shade was likely already 110 degrees Fahrenheit. His tongue had swollen to the point where it pressed against his teeth. His lips were cracked and bleeding. When he tried to swallow, nothing happened. His mouth had simply run out of saliva. The final ounce of water sat in the cracked bottle next to him, and Robert stared at it with the kind of desire he'd never felt for anything in his life. Not yet. Save it for the critical moment. But when was the critical moment? Now. 2 hours from now, when he could no longer think straight. The tactical problem with dehydration is that it destroys the very capability you need to manage it. Judgment. Robert forced himself to conduct a systems check. Cognitive function, degraded but operational. He could still perform basic math, recall his training, make sequential decisions. Motor function, significantly impaired. His hands trembled. When he tried to stand, his legs nearly gave out. Vision, experiencing peripheral distortion, not yet hallucinating, but close. Core temperature, elevated. He could feel it. That internal heat that meant his body was losing the ability to thermoregulate. Heat exhaustion was transitioning to heat stroke. The timeline was accelerating. At 11:23, Robert heard the vehicle. At first, he thought it was a hallucination, the brain creating what it desperately wanted to experience. But the sound persisted, a distant engine, growing gradually louder. Coming from the east. On the road above, Robert's training kicked in immediately. He had maybe 30 seconds to make himself visible before the vehicle passed. He scrambled out of the alcove, his legs barely responding. The sun hit him like a physical blow, a wall of heat that stole his breath. He crawled up the embankment of the wash, fingers digging into loose sand, boots slipping. The engine sound was closer now, maybe a quarter mile. Robert reached the top of the embankment and pulled himself onto level ground. The road was 100 yards away, the same road he'd left hours ago. He stood, wavering, and began running. Running is the wrong word. He staggered forward in a shambling gait that barely qualified as locomotion, his peripheral vision tunneling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. 50 yards. The vehicle appeared, a pickup truck, moving slowly, someone inside scanning the desert. Looking for something. Looking for him. Robert tried to shout. Nothing came out but a dry rasp. He waved his arms, stumbling forward. 30 yards. The truck was still moving, pulling ahead. The driver hadn't seen him. Robert's hand went to his belt, finding the Benchmade knife. He pulled it out, opened the blade, and angled it to catch the sun. The signal mirror technique, using any reflective surface to flash light toward a target. He'd taught it 100 times to corporate executives who thought they'd never need it. The blade caught the sun and threw a brilliant flash toward the truck's windshield. Once, twice, 3 times. The truck's brake lights flared red. The driver was a woman in her 60s. a local rancher named Patricia who'd been checking her fence lines. She took one look at Robert and immediately grabbed a gallon jug of water from the truck bed. "Easy," she said, pulling it away as Robert tried to drink. "Small sips. You chug that, you'll vomit it right back up." She was right. Robert's hands shook as he brought the bottle to his lips, forcing himself to take tiny, controlled sips despite every cell in his body screaming to drink. Patricia got him into the truck's air-conditioned cab, and Robert felt the cool air hit his superheated skin. Too fast, he was cooling too rapidly. His body began to shiver violently despite the ambient heat. "You're the guy with the broken-down Ford," Patricia said, not asking. "Saw it yesterday afternoon. Was gonna call it in when I got back to the ranch. But cell service out here is shit." Robert nodded, still unable to form words. "Wrong fork," Patricia continued, starting to drive. "The road you took dead ends at an abandoned mine about 12 miles south. Nothing out there but rattlesnakes and regret." Wrong fork. Robert had guessed wrong. If he'd kept walking, he would have hit a dead end in the middle of nowhere, with no water, in full daylight. The desert had been about to close the trap completely. Patricia drove Robert to her ranch, 15 miles northwest of where she'd found him. She had a small medical kit and basic communications equipment. Within 2 hours, Robert was being evaluated by a rural volunteer EMT crew from Pahrump. Diagnosis: severe dehydration, approximately 7% body fluid loss. Stage 2 heat exhaustion, approaching heat stroke. Minor lacerations and abrasions. Rhabdomyolysis, muscle breakdown from extreme exertion. They started in 4 immediately, pumping cold saline into his system. The EMT, a guy named Carlos who'd done 3 tours as an army medic, looked at Robert's military tattoo and nodded. "You got lucky," Carlos said. "Another 2 hours, we'd be having a different conversation." Or no conversation at all. Robert spent the night at the ranch, rehydrating, recovering. Patricia refused payment, refused thanks, refused anything except a promise that he'd check his route planning more carefully next time. "Desert don't give second chances," she said. "But sometimes we do." Lying in Patricia's guest room that night, Robert ran through the entire event with the methodical analysis of an after-action review. What went right? Initial heat mitigation strategies extended survivability. Decision to move during night hours was correct. Shelter selection bought critical survival time. Maintained enough cognitive function to signal effectively. Never gave up. What went wrong? Initial route decision, the shortcut. Inadequate equipment for environment. No emergency water. No communication plan. No notification of travel route. Wrong navigation choice at the fork. Water bottle failure due to fall. Nearly waited too long to signal for rescue. Critical factors. Patricia's fence-checking route happened to pass that area that day. The timing of his emergence from the wash aligned with her transit. The sun angle was correct for a blade signal flash. She actually saw the flash. Remove any one of those factors, and Robert Chun becomes a statistic. In Special Forces, they taught that luck is the intersection of preparation and opportunity. Robert's preparation, his training, his systematic approach, his refusal to panic, created the conditions where luck could find him. But it was still luck. This information could save someone's life, so I'm going to make this extremely clear. The heat casualty progression. Heat cramps, muscle spasms, usually in legs or abdomen, caused by electrolyte imbalance. Treatable with rest, shade, and fluids with salt. Heat exhaustion, heavy sweating, weakness, cold clammy skin, fast weak pulse, nausea. Core temp 100 to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. This is what Robert was experiencing. Still reversible with aggressive cooling and hydration. Heat stroke, no sweating, body's cooling system has failed. Hot dry skin, rapid strong pulse, confusion, loss of consciousness. Core temp above 104 degrees. This is a medical emergency. Organ damage and death occur rapidly. Field treatment priorities. 1. Move to shade immediately. Every minute in direct sun accelerates the progression. 2. Begin cooling gradually. Rapid cooling can cause shock. Wet skin with water and fan if possible. Focus on major blood vessels, neck, armpits, groin. 3. Hydrate slowly. If conscious and able to swallow, small sips every few minutes. If unconscious, do not give fluids orally. You'll cause aspiration. 4. Monitor mental status. Confusion, slurred speech, irrational behavior are all signs of progression toward heat stroke. Patricia's decision to limit Robert's water intake. This was absolutely correct. After severe dehydration, the stomach lining is compromised. Drinking too fast causes vomiting, losing the water you just consumed. Hyponatremia, dangerously diluted blood sodium. Gastric distension and cramping. The protocol is 3 to 4 ounces every 15 minutes for the first hour, then increase gradually if tolerated. The 4 solution. Cold saline 4 is the gold standard for severe dehydration because bypasses compromised digestive system, delivers fluids directly to bloodstream, includes electrolytes, sodium chloride, can be precisely controlled. Carlos was right to start the 4 immediately. Robert's 7% fluid loss was bordering on the threshold where outcomes rapidly deteriorate. Now here's what you need to understand. Robert's survival came down to a 10-second window when Patricia happened to be in visual range. That's not a plan. That's a prayer. And the desert doesn't answer prayers reliably. Robert Chin sat in his home office in Las Vegas, staring at a new piece of equipment on his desk, a Garmin InReach satellite communicator. $450. The price of a guaranteed rescue call from anywhere on Earth. The price of not relying on luck. His truck had been towed from Route 372. The engine a total loss, a seized piston caused by a catastrophic coolant leak. The mechanic estimated it had failed over the course of several miles, but Robert had been distracted, listening to music, not monitoring his gauges closely enough. A small inattention, a cascade of consequences. He'd spent the 2 weeks since his rescue conducting his own version of an after-action review, but deeper than the initial analysis. This was the kind of review that examined not just tactical decisions, but the underlying assumptions that led to the tactical situation in the first place. What he found disturbed him. 6 years out of Special Forces, Robert had unconsciously shifted into what he now recognized as civilian mode, a mindset that assumed systems would work, that infrastructure was reliable, that help was always a phone call away. He'd become, in a word, soft. Not physically, he still maintained decent fitness. But mentally, he'd lost the edge that came from operating in environments where mistakes were measured in body bags. The shortcut was a civilian decision. The inadequate emergency equipment was a civilian oversight. The lack of a communication plan was civilian negligence. In Fifth Group, they drilled into him. Hope is not a course of action. Planning prevents panic. He'd forgotten that. Or more accurately, he'd stopped applying it to daily life. Robert opened his laptop and created a new document titled Personal Emergency Protocols. He began typing. Rule 1. Route planning. File trip itinerary with 2 separate contacts. Include exact route, alternative routes, expected arrival times, check-in schedule. Never deviate without notification. No shortcuts through unfamiliar terrain. Rule 2. Vehicle equipment. Desert and remote areas. Satellite communicator with SOS function. Non-negotiable. Minimum 3 gallons emergency water. Reflective emergency blanket. Road flares and mirror. First aid kit, expanded. Fire starter, multiple methods. Knife and multi-tool. 48-hour food supply. Topographic maps, paper backup. Compass. Portable battery bank. Rule 3. Environmental adaptation. Check weather forecast 24 hours before departure. Understand terrain-specific hazards. Carry clothing appropriate for nighttime temperature extremes. Pack for worst-case scenario, not best case. Rule 4. Communication protocol. Scheduled check-ins at predetermined intervals. Missed check-in triggers, search protocol. Emergency contacts have access to trip details and vehicle information. Rule 5. The 72-hour rule. Any remote travel must assume self-sufficiency for minimum 72 hours. Rescue cannot be assumed. Preparation is mandatory, not optional. He stared at the list. It was basic, fundamental, the kind of thing he would have laughed at someone for not knowing during his active duty days. And yet he'd violated nearly every point. Robert's security consulting business had focused primarily on corporate executive protection and risk assessment, teaching people how to avoid danger in urban and international settings. The Mojave experience changed his curriculum. He designed a new course, Civilian Survival Skills for Remote Environment Travel. Not wilderness survival for preppers or enthusiasts, but practical, No-nonsense preparation for ordinary people who might find themselves in extraordinary circumstances. Week 1. Vehicle preparation and emergency equipment. Week 2. Navigation and communication fundamentals. Week 3. Water procurement and thermal management. Week 4. Signaling and self-rescue techniques. Week 5. Medical self-aid and heat casualty prevention. He beta tested the course with 20 students, lawyers, doctors, retirees, young couples who liked camping, people who drove through deserts and mountains and remote areas without a second thought about what would happen if something went wrong. The response was overwhelming. 3 of his students had similar stories, times when they'd been stranded, times when equipment had failed, times when they'd gotten lucky. The common thread: everyone assumed it wouldn't happen to them. Everyone assumed help would come. Everyone assumed civilization was closer than it actually was. For months after the breakdown, Robert drove back to Nevada State Route 372. He'd planned this trip with military precision, satellite communicator active and tested, 6 gallons of emergency water, complete vehicle mechanical inspection, trip itinerary filed with 3 contacts, scheduled check-ins every 6 hours. He brought Patricia, the rancher who'd saved his life, along as a gesture of thanks. They drove in his new truck, a Toyota 4Runner specifically equipped for remote travel. When they reached the spot where his F-150 had died, Robert pulled over. The road was still empty, the desert still indifferent, the same heat still radiating off the asphalt in visible waves. "Hard to believe someone could die here," Patricia said, looking out at the landscape. "Looks so peaceful. That's what makes it dangerous." Robert replied, "It doesn't look like an enemy. It looks like nothing, just empty space." He walked to the edge of the road, standing approximately where he'd stood 4 months ago, calculating his odds, making his decisions. The wash where he'd sheltered was visible in the distance, a darker line cutting through the creosote flats. "You ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't come along?" Patricia asked. "Every day," Robert said, and it was true. He ran the counterfactual constantly. If she'd taken a different fence line, if she'd been running an hour earlier or later, if the sun angle had been different and the blade flash hadn't caught her eye. Remove any single variable, and he dies on that road. His body found days or weeks later by another rancher or a highway patrol officer. Another statistic in the National Park Service's search and rescue reports. "I teach survival skills now," Robert continued, "and the first thing I tell people is that survival isn't about knowing how to build a fire or filter water. Those skills matter, but they're secondary." "What's primary?" Patricia asked. "Not needing them in the first place. Not making the decisions that put you in the survival situation. Having the equipment and the protocols and the planning that prevent the crisis from happening." He paused, looking at the empty road stretching in both directions. "My whole military career was about being prepared for violence, for combat, for the worst-case scenario. And then I retired and just stopped applying that mindset to regular life. I took a shortcut through the desert with half a bottle of water and no communication plan because I thought, what's the worst that could happen?" He turned to Patricia. "You showed me what the worst was, and I got lucky. But luck isn't preparation. Luck is what happens when preparation fails and the universe decides not to kill you anyway." Robert and Patricia stood in the desert heat for another few minutes, silent, before walking back to the truck. As they drove away, Robert looked in the rearview mirror at the empty road disappearing behind them. Somewhere out there was the wash where he'd sheltered, the spot where he'd fallen and lost his water, the fork where he'd guessed wrong. The Mojave had taught him something that 12 years in special forces had taught him, but civilian life had let him forget. The environment doesn't care about your experience. It doesn't care about your training. It doesn't care about your confidence or your capabilities. It simply exists, neutral and lethal, waiting to exploit the smallest mistake. Survival isn't about being tough. It's about being smart enough to not need to be tough. Preparation isn't paranoia. It's respect. Respect for the environment. Respect for probability. Respect for the thin line between alive and dead. 2 months later, Robert received a call from Carlos, the EMT who'd treated him. Carlos wanted to bring his search and rescue team through Robert's survival course. "We find people in the desert every summer," Carlos said. "Most of them dead. Some of them just barely not dead. And all of them, every single one, thought it wouldn't happen to them." Robert smiled. "When do you want to start?" This is the most important section of this entire video, so I need you to pay attention. Robert Chin survived because of training he received decades ago, deployed in a crisis, with a heavy dose of luck. You might not have that training. You definitely shouldn't rely on that luck. Here's how you build a system that prevents the crisis in the first place. The notification protocol. Never, and I mean never, travel in remote areas without someone knowing exactly where you're going. Exact route, including alternates. Expected arrival time. Check-in schedule. What to do if you miss a check-in. I use this format. I'm driving from Las Vegas to Salt Lake City via I-15. Departing 8 o'clock. Expected arrival 14:30. I'll text you from Cedar City at approximately 11 o'clock. If you don't hear from me by 12 o'clock, call Highway Patrol. The equipment standard. For any trip through remote desert or mountain terrain, your vehicle must have 1. Communication. Satellite communicator with SOS function. Cell phones are not sufficient. They have zero coverage in most remote areas. 2. Water. 1 gallon per person per day. Minimum 3-day supply. This is non-negotiable. 3. Shelter and thermal protection. Emergency blankets, tarp, or bivy. Desert nights can drop to 40 degrees Fahrenheit even when days are 115 degrees. 4. Signaling. Road flares, signal mirror, whistle. Multiple methods increase rescue probability. 5. Navigation. Paper maps and compass as backup to GPS and phone. 6. Medical. Expanded first aid kit including items for heat casualties, trauma, and extended care. The decision framework. When facing a survival situation, use this priority sequence. 1. Immediate life threats, severe bleeding, airway obstruction, extreme environmental exposure. Address these in the first 60 seconds. 2. Shelter and thermal regulation. Get out of extreme heat or cold. This is your primary enemy in most environments. 3. Signaling. If rescue is possible, make yourself findable immediately. Don't wait. 4. Water. Locate, secure, or ration existing water supply. At extreme temperatures, you have hours, not days. 5. Sustained survival. Food, long-term shelter, navigation toward help. Only relevant if immediate rescue is unlikely. The stay versus go calculation. This is controversial, so understand the nuances. Stay if someone knows your location and expected arrival. Your vehicle provides adequate shelter. You have sufficient water for 72 plus hours. Rescue is likely within 24 to 48 hours. The environment is immediately lethal, sandstorm, blizzard, etc. Move if no one knows where you are. No rescue expected for days or weeks. Vehicle provides no shelter or protection. You have clear knowledge of civilization direction and distance. Environmental conditions allow safe travel. Robert's case met the move criteria, but barely. The decision could have gone either way. The mindset component. Here's what most survival courses won't tell you. The physical skills are secondary. Primary is the mental framework. 1. Accept the reality immediately. Denial kills. The second you realize you're in a survival situation, accept it fully and begin systematic response. 2. Suppress panic through action. Panic is a cognitive failure state. Override it with methodical task execution. 3. Make decisions early. Your capacity for good decision-making degrades with time in survival situations. Decide while you're still fully capable. 4. Conserve physical and mental resources. Every action has a cost. Evaluate cost versus benefit constantly. 5. Never quit. Survival is often a war of attrition against despair. Maintain purpose and forward movement. Now, I want you to do something. Right now, today, go to your vehicle. Look in the trunk or back seat. Tell me in the comments. If you broke down right now in a remote area, how long could you survive with what you currently have? Be honest, because the desert is. Robert Ironside Chun walks into the Nevada desert now with his students, teaching them the skills that saved his life and the preparation that should have prevented the need to use them. He keeps a photo on his office wall, the wash where he's sheltered, taken from the road above. A reminder, not a reminder of survival, a reminder of failure. Because he didn't survive through excellence, he survived through luck. And luck is not a skill you can train. The students who take his course learn practical skills. how to signal for rescue, how to find water, how to manage heat casualties. But more importantly, they learned the lesson Robert learned on Route 372. The best survival story is the one that never needs to be told. The best rescue is the one that never needs to be called. The best training is preparation you never have to use. Patricia still checks her fence lines on that section of Route 372. She's found 2 more stranded travelers since Robert, both with dead cell phones, both with minimal water, both making the same assumptions he made. She gave them water, gave them rides, gave them the same advice she gave Robert. The desert doesn't give second chances, but sometimes we do. If you're watching this video, you're thinking about survival. You're thinking about preparation. You're thinking about what you would do in Robert's situation. Good. But don't stop there. Look at your vehicle. Check your equipment. File your trip plans. Respect the environment you're entering. Because the military taught Robert Shun how to survive impossible situations. But civilian life taught him something more important. Don't create impossible situations in the first place. Preparation is a mindset. Survival is a tactic. This is Expert Survival Guide. Hashtag end screen. 55:00-56:00. If Robert's story taught you something, drop a comment below with your location and your current level of vehicle emergency preparedness. Let's build a community that doesn't need survival stories because we're too well prepared to create them. Hit subscribe for more real survival analysis. And remember, the desert is still out there, neutral and lethal, waiting to teach the next lesson to whoever assumes they don't need to learn it. Stay prepared. Stay alive.